Welcome, everyone. My name is Julia Isaacs, and I'm happy to host you today from the Urban Institute. I'm just checking. Yes, the recording is on. This is the second webinar in our series, Building Your Data and Research Skills to Answer Policy Questions. In the September 13th session, we are focusing on getting help answering your policy questions, how to plan for research procurement. Next slide. I want to start by covering some housekeeping matters. This webinar is being recorded. We will post the slides and recording and transcript online a few months after the webinar. We will email you the links when the materials are ready. We have enabled closed captioning to help make the webinar more accessible. As you probably know, you can use the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen to show or hide or adjust the settings. Next slide. So I'm hoping this will be interactive. And so we would really like to hear from you. I see we already have close to 40 people online. So for now, we have you muted. We have scheduled 2 times for your questions and reflections, but at any point, you can write your questions or comments in the chat box at any time. Please do use the chat box rather than the Q&A so that everyone can see each other's questions. It makes it more fun, we think. You are muted now. During the Q&A time, you will be able to, use that reactions button to raise your virtual hand so we can unmute you. But to start off, let's go to the chat. And I'm curious, why are you attending this webinar? What do you hope to learn? You can see those questions in the chat, and I'll pause a minute so you can begin typing. And please continue typing while I give a few more introductory remarks. The next slide. I do want to say that this webinar is an activity of the Child Care Research and Evaluation Capacity Building Center. And I'm speaking to you in my role as project director. The center is supported through the Office of Planning, Research and Evaluation, OPRE, in the Administration for Children and Families, ACF. And it's managed through a contract with the Urban Institute in partnership with Mathematica. Our project officer is Alicia Blandon, and we're happy that she's online today. My center colleague, Peter Willenberg, is supporting me behind the scenes today. I'm also joined by Teresa Derrick Mills, co-principal investigator, who I will introduce shortly because she has a major speaking role. We're also assisted by Nick Laughlin of Urban's event team. So the goal of the center is to support CCDF lead agencies in building research and evaluation capacity. We have a variety of activities we do, web events, written materials. To learn more, you can go to our Building Childcare Research Capacity website, and Peter will drop that link in the chat. Next slide. So today for our topic, on planning research procurement, we have, 3 exciting speakers, and then I will play the role of moderator. I think I've introduced myself as a senior fellow at the Urban Institute. Teresa Derrick Mills is a principal research associate at the Urban Institute, and she co-leads a research and evaluation needs assessment of CCDF. And she designs and facilitates communities of practice for CCDF lead agencies and their research partners. And she works on different resources that may be useful to you, including the Procuring Research Guide that we will be sharing with you today. She draws on more than 25 years working in and studying childcare and early education services. Our next speaker is Jocelyn Bound, who is the Deputy Commissioner for Research, Innovation, and Supports at the Massachusetts Department of Early Care and Education, where she manages the coordination and integration of research into program and policy planning. Her portfolio includes the designs of supports and expectations for educators, redesign of the program quality support system, and testing of innovative approaches to funding programs. She got her doctorate from the Harvard Graduate School of Education in March 2014. Before her doctoral studies, she was an early childhood teacher for 10 years in New York City. I wonder how many other former early childhood teachers we have on this call. And I'd like to introduce Ariel Ford, who is the director for the Division of Child Development and Early Education for North Carolina's Department of Health and Human Services. In that role, she is the CCDF lead administrator. She has over 20 years of experience working across the field of early childhood education. She's passionate about developing early childhood programs, policies, and systems that make a difference in the lives of children, families, and early educators. And again, I think many of us on this call share that passion. Now, I would like to know who you are. So, Nick, could you launch our poll to learn who is in our audience today? So we want to know if you are state or territory CCDF lead agency staff, tribal CCDF lead agency staff, external researchers, federal staff, TA providers, or other. Now pause for you to vote. Nick, do we have, should I hold it open or should you close the poll?
Looks like we're at 83%, so I think we can go ahead and close it.
Thank you, Nick. I'd love to see the results so I can share them. Okay, this is wonderful. We have 17 state territory CCDF lead agency staff on the line. That's more than half of you. Oh, and this is wonderful. We have 6 tribal CCDF lead agency staff. That's 19% of you. We do have a few external researchers, TA providers, and a few other. Thank you. It's great to have all you on the webinar, and I am very excited to have so many state, territory, and tribal CCDF lead agency staff. I'm looking at the chat and I hear why people are here. I'm just going to read one response. Rachel leads research and evaluation for a state agency, and she's understaffed, as I imagine you're not the only one. And we have research questions and funds that can support research but don't have a short-term RFP, RFA process to engage external researchers. Hopefully this will be helpful to you. I also see Christina, who says she's always hoping to learn from peer states to identify strategies and approaches that the district can use. Okay, well, let's go on to the meat of our presentation. Next slide. The format today, thank you, is that first Teresa Derrick Mills will introduce you to this report she wrote on procuring research and evaluation services, and she will share tips, lessons learned, and resources on this important topic about how you go about contracting for research services. Then I'm very excited to say you'll get to hear directly from Ariel Ford and Jocelyn Bown about their experience procuring research and evaluation services in their work as state CCDF lead agency staff. And then there'll be time for you to ask questions and share your perspectives. And we've split this in two, so Teresa will share half of what she wants to share, and we'll go through this order, and then we'll have a second round of Teresa sharing insights from our guest speakers and Q&A from you. With that introduction, let me now turn to Teresa for the first half of her presentation.
Thank you so much, Julia, and welcome everybody. I'm so pleased that you could join us today. I'm going to start by giving an overview of planning for procuring research and evaluation services. Next slide. So one thing that we are hoping can be of help to you is our procurement guide for CCDF lead agencies. And my colleague will be dropping a link to that in the chat. Inside this guide, essentially you'll find four primary things. It's designed to help you understand procurement terms. It has in-text definitions and a glossary at the end. We really find that procurement terms can be so specific and they can be kind of confusing. And so this guide is designed to help you manage that. It's also designed to help you know where to look for more information. You can find resource tips and links throughout. So one of the things we found when we were creating the guide is that it isn't always obvious where to look. When you're in any particular state, it's a little bit different. And then it can also help you anticipate steps, timelines, and questions to ask. Inside, we provide you with some steps and explain in plain language what that means and how to walk through those steps. And it can help you remember through a checklist that you can find at the end of the document. Next slide. So before we go any further, I'm going to pause for a moment to answer this question. What is procurement? So just so we can make sure we're all on the same page, and it's not a term we all use every day, but really it means something very simple. It's about getting goods and services from other entities rather than making or providing them yourself. So basically you need somebody else's help to do the work that you want to do. In public procurement, where a government agency is getting what it needs, it's also about determining what is needed and who can best meet the need at the right place, at the right time, and for the best price. It's also about providing a fair and open process for meeting the needs. So in other words, if you're doing procurement for yourself personally or for a private group or for the government, it's all about getting goods and services from other entities. But if you're doing it for the government, there are some additional things that you want to be thinking about and looking for in that process. Next slide. So knowing the key steps in procuring services helps you anticipate timelines and staffing to manage the procurement process. So even though what you're trying to do is to get somebody to help you do something, it's still in and of itself like a project that you have to manage. So you start by determining the need. What do you need and when do you need it? You need to learn the requirements for your governmental agency. And it might be that your particular agency doesn't have specific requirements. What you're trying to learn is what your state requires. And anyway, there are tips in here about trying to figure that part out. You'll need to write up and advertise what you need. And then you'll need to review the proposals and select who will do the work. There are many steps in the process that will require your team to work with other state agencies. And so you need to give yourself some lead time. And we'll be talking a little bit more about each of these steps. Next slide. So the first question is, do you need to procure research services? And your answer can be that you can choose to work with internal and external research partners. So one or the other or both. So you might have a team of researchers in your agency, but perhaps they can't handle, like time-wise, all of the things that you need to be examining and researching. Or perhaps they have a certain kind of expertise and you need an additional kind of expertise. So it's not really either or about whether you will do things internally or someone will do things externally. It's often a pairing. External research partners you secure through procurement can help your agency learn more from your existing data, gather new information to understand needs, gaps, perspectives, and experiences, evaluate your current efforts and programs, and support continuous learning, accountability, and help plan for the future. Next slide. If you decide that you do want research help, the next question is, how do you learn procurement requirements in your agency? You can check in with your procurement office if you know where that is. And if you don't know where that is, the National Association of State Procurement Officials has a website where they list where the procurement offices are for each state. There's a good chance you're still going to have to do some legwork and work your way through, like who really helps with procuring research. Is it the same rules as for procuring computers, for example? But this is a great place to start, and we have tips that are located throughout the guide. And Ariel and Jocelyn are going to have tips for you as well. And now I'll turn the session back to Julia so we can hear more from firsthand experience to bring this to life. Julia?
Thanks, Teresa. I think I'll want the next slide. And I do appreciate your laying out a clear introduction to procurement, what it is and how to learn more about it, because we can't explain it all in one webinar, but we hope to get you started or to support you as you continue to work on procurement. So now it's time for insights from our guests, Ariel Ford from North Carolina and Jocelyn Bound from Massachusetts. After they speak, it'll be your turn, the audience, for questions and reflections and comments. And we do welcome these. You can put them in the chat as people are talking, and we'd love to hear from you, especially CCDF lead agency staff, and your questions can be directed to anyone. We also will, when they're done talking, we'll have a time for those Q&As. So Nick, could you take down the slide and have the Zoom spotlight on me and our two guests? Great. Let me start with you, Ariel. First of all, thank you for joining us when you're taking time out of your busy schedule. So could you say more about why, as a CCDF lead administrator, you think it's valuable to procure research services and to use a good process for doing so?
Absolutely, and thank you for having me. This is kind of a specialty webinar, but one that I think we probably don't give enough credit to as lead state administrators, et cetera. So I welcome the opportunity to talk. So I think there's a couple of things that really come to mind for me. And the first is that I have a lot of, I think a lot about how my individual work and the work of the Division of Child Development and Early Education can be a conduit to bringing more trust to government. So I know that there are lots of people who don't really believe that government can execute well or can kind of carry out the promises that we make. And it's important to me in the ways that I work inside government that I try to combat that sentiment and that we're showing actual movement toward goals. So I think for me, there's kind of this first set of work that we have a lot of integrity around the process and that we are trying to put funds toward the things that make the most difference for our state. And I don't know a way to do that without having good research about what works well and what we are doing that works well or not so well. And I think so we can't shy away from either of those things. So it's kind of thing one. That's the first thing that I think about. And then the second is just, over the past 2 years, through COVID and through a racial reckoning, one of the lessons that I hope we are all taking away, and a lesson that I've taken away, is how vital it is to have a diversity of opinions at the table, that not any one of us has all of the right answers or has all of the, can see all of the facets and lenses that we need to be seeing as we make policy decisions. And so it's really important to me that we think about how we structure research to help us combat our own biases and our own the ways in which we are in the water of systemic inequities. So how am I using a research agenda to help me understand the richness and diversity of my state in a way that maybe my lens as a state administrator, as a white woman, doesn't let me see? So those are kind of two different priorities that I have around research as a state administrator in North Carolina.
Sorry, I unmuted myself and was about to speak, and I was like, oh no, I should unmute myself. Okay, thank you, Ariel. I appreciate your taking a step back and bringing us into those big, values of integrity and diversity. Jocelyn, could you say, how do you see research procurement as supporting the work of your agency?
Absolutely, and thank you also. I echo thanks for having us here and having this conversation. I know when I first started in this role, or slightly different role, but quite a few years back, having to sort of come in and manage a large procurement without having ever done it before, I would have loved a guide like this. So really, really appreciate your work on it. I mean, I echo everything that Ariel said, and just thank you for laying that out so clearly. I think research is really, really essential to the process of doing strong policy work, both in thinking about what do we already know and how does that inform our planning going ahead, as well as testing, what are we doing and is it working and for whom? Also being a really critical question right now, so that, we don't get caught in the trap of figuring everything out, feeling like we figured everything out, and then suddenly we're locked into something where there's no changing, there's no flexibility, there's no learning and adjusting as we go. And I particularly feel right now in this time where there's been so much change in response to COVID, we're in a moment where, I think remembering to bring research and that reflection time into our work is so critically important. And I think I would just add to that a strong procurement process is one mechanism and tool that we have to make sure that the research is of the quality and is well designed for the questions that we're asking. There are many types of research questions, there are many types of research activities that will answer different kinds of questions. And I've found that a really well-structured research procurement will really do a great job of finding high quality support, and also, sort of starting the conversation with those who can do the research about, what is exactly the best research for the questions that we're asking? How do we get beyond sort of the learning agenda that we can identify for ourselves as in our policy work to, like, what actually does it take to answer these questions?
Thank you, Jocelyn. I appreciate your reminding us of the importance of the quality of the research and how the procurement process can affect that quality. So I heard Teresa talk about the need for lead time when planning to procure research and evaluation services. So I'm curious, how much time would you say it typically takes between when you start the planning process and when the contractor starts working? I guess, is it less than a year, more than a year, or is it really vary a lot? And Jocelyn, I'll start with you this time.
So it really does, the timelines really do depend on the complexity of the project. If there's something that we're doing that is relatively well defined, it's relatively straightforward, we can get a scope written very, very quickly. And the response time that's needed for a vendor to give an adequate response is often not very long. So we could potentially, from the point of writing the RFR, particularly if it's one we've used in the past, so we don't have, we're editing rather than starting from scratch, we could probably get a full process completed in a few months. But certainly for more complex projects and larger projects or projects that are new, it takes some time and is worth the time to really think through what is it that we need, what are we asking for, how can we articulate this as clearly as possible in an RFR? Because the more clear the RFR is about our needs, the better the responses will be that we get back from potential vendors. And then the other piece of that will be allowing vendors enough time to put together a sufficient response, so that when you are reviewing responses, you are really working with full information of what's possible and what each vendor can provide. So, that can take a few more months. We do work on a yearly budget. So that initial procurement period for us would never take more than a year, just because, we really, unless there's something that we're, planning ahead for the next fiscal year, typically we would try to at least get the contract in place during the budget period that we're, using the funding from to cover.
Thanks, Jocelyn. I think these real world experiences help people. Ariel, what's your experience?
Yeah, pretty similar. I would say there's an aspirational answer and there is an honest answer. And I think the honest answer is probably close to a year or longer. And we also have a 1-year budget cycle. I think the thing is, though, if you're talking about from the time that you kind of recognize you need a research project or you have an idea that you want to do something, that germination can take a really long time. And to echo Jocelyn, like it's not worth it to rush that. Figuring out what the right questions are is it is just not worth cheating yourself out of that time. It's just not worth it. And so my recommendation is just to, like, no matter how fast you want it to go and everything's always behind, it's still worth it to spend the time. I would also say part of what makes a difference is if you have people to staff the project. And so if it's like me, if I'm the project manager on it, it's going to take a really long time because I don't have a lot of time to do that. If I can kind of outsource it to a subject matter expert, it can go a little bit faster, but it still takes time. I don't know. I just don't think that's worth it to rush it. I would also say, like, something we're thinking about is kind of and Jocelyn, I'm wondering if this is maybe the delineation between the kinds of research you're talking about, is we're thinking about kind of like required or perfunctory research. So, like, what are the things that we have to do to meet either grant requirements or those kinds of things, legislative mandates, and what are the things that we need to know for our own so that we can do better by our state. And so those are two, like, the first one is, as you were talking about, pretty well defined. There's a clear scope. We know what we're looking for. And the other is, like, a lot harder to conceptualize. And so getting the scope right just is a grind, but so worth it. So I think those are two different kinds of RFPs we would be putting out, or RFAs.
Thank you. And as you emphasize, you have to know the right research questions. It reminded me, I should say, this is the second in our webinar series. And our first in August was on, the title was something like, how to ask good research questions. And so we will put the link to that. People who are on this webinar will get the link to that as well as to this one. So a question for both of you. Could you talk about how you learned about the procurement rules in your state? How much did you learn by asking others and how much did you learn by doing? Jocelyn.
Okay. I couldn't remember. So I asked a lot of questions. I found that the fiscal team in our agency sort of managed the procurement process in general terms. So they were my go-to source for information about, what are the steps that I had to take? What did I have to create? How did I post this? They supported the posting process and some of the mechanics of the process. That being said, there was still, and I actually still feel like I'm learning. But research procurements are not your standard procurements. They're very, very different. And the procurement, you have to kind of work within the procurement process a little bit to get what you want. So, I had one false start. I learned by making mistakes. I was told that I needed to cap indirect at 15%, which I think for many people in this audience, you can understand how well that went over. And so, I was not able to successfully contract with anybody out of that initial procurement. I had to go back and say, look, this didn't work. And this is what I'm hearing is the problem. Lo and behold, it actually wasn't a rule beyond sort of an internal standard of practice. I just didn't have enough knowledge to question it out of the gate. So we went back and we changed that. And then I was able to procure successfully. So I think there just are just recognizing that there are a lot of rules around procurement. And then there's the process by which whoever is supporting you in doing the procurement process has learned to meet those rules It is always worth asking questions, checking to see, does it have to be that way? And with an explanation as to why you might want to do it differently. And I found that people really are very responsive and helpful, but sometimes I do have to be the one asking the question. The most recent thing I've discovered is we can do something called the request for information. I haven't tried it yet, but I'm really excited about it because one of my biggest challenges was figuring out how to price projects out of the gate. And it's a way to put information out that we have, and I suspect other states do, saying this is something that we're going to be procuring for, would you be willing to tell us, answer some questions about what it would take to do this work? It's not, you're not going to contract, you're just gathering information that then, including how much it might cost, that you can then use to support the process. So that was my learning curve.
Thanks. And I appreciate everyone sharing their learning curves. We are hoping that we can be supporting each other in all learning this. So Ariel, how did you learn about procurement rules?
Yeah, I had a similar trajectory. So messing up a lot and then having to kind of go back humbly with my tail between my legs. And I would just say the thing that I would maybe add to what Jocelyn shared, I would just echo everything she shared and say that it has been helpful for me to know who the internal gatekeepers are and to build relationships with them so that I can, have a cup of coffee with them or hit them up on Teams really quickly to kind of like keep them in the know about what the process is so that when something gets to their desk, it does not kind of crash and burn the whole project. So knowing who those people are that are going to have a lot of questions for good reasons. I mean, it's people who've been there a long time and they know what doesn't work, but there's lots of good reasons. But I think that managing your people is maybe an underrated part of what we should be doing as kind of contract managers or contract developers. Have you had that experience, Jocelyn? Yeah.
I second everything you just said.
Great. Well, thank you for this first round of insights. And I hope I thank Teresa for starting us off on this. So now I'm looking to the audience. Do you have any questions, reflections, comments? I'll give you a choice of how to share them. You can just type them into the chat, or there should be a raise hand button in Zoom. You can raise your hand and then we'll unmute you and you can say it out loud. What is the status of the agency's internal research capacity? I imagine the answer is different for each of you. Could you say a little bit about your agency's internal research capacity?
Happy to start. So for quite a few years, it was me, and I had a second job. So there was a lot of, trying to take on both managing a project and managing a variety of research projects for the agency. Most of which, all of which were contracted out. So what I was doing was not a lot of data analytics and research myself. It was managing contracts with researchers. We have since started to build out and now have a growing team of 2 with 1 open position and potentially 1 more data analyst. So I think over time, doing some of this and showing the value and sort of supporting different people at different parts of the agency and integrating research into their work, I've been able to make a case for added investment.
And we don't have any. So our approach is just that this is a service that is best done by external partners. And so that is how that's how we approach this. So we have subject matter experts that are kind of points of contact and lead on contract management with the vendor. But internally, I think for us, and I don't know that this is right or wrong, I think it's just an agency decision. Well, I guess it's a couple things. It's if you have a limited number of FTEs, which we do, I mean, we have to ask for FTEs from the General Assembly. And so if you have a limited number of those, how best to spend your human capital. And then the second thing is back to that kind of like, how do we make sure that we are elevating the ways in which government can work successfully alongside other partners and have that integrity. And so one of the ways for us that looks like is to have external research partners. So I think, I don't think there's a right or wrong to that. I think there's like a right decision for the moment, or a best guess decision for the moment. And I think that would change over time with agencies and leadership and kind of the climate of your community.
Yeah, I imagine that the people here have a range of experience of how much internal research capacity you have in your agencies. And, it could be a quarter of somebody's time. I think capacity and you could be lucky if it's a quarter of someone's time, or it could be more. It really ranges. So another good question. So I don't know, wasn't planning to have Teresa on for this part, but maybe we should add Teresa into the spotlight too. Could you do that? Thank you. So I don't know who wants to answer this. You mentioned that research procurement is very different from other procurements. Can you expand on how they are different specifically?
I think that may have been my comment. So I can certainly share what I mean, but I think it would be great for everybody to, share their own perspective on this. So from the experience that I had is that the procurements that we were used to doing were about things that are a little bit more concrete, or you knew in advance exactly what you were asking for. I mean, not quite doorknobs, but, I want technical assistance on this topic for this many sessions. And, you could really spell out the deliverables that you wanted right out of the gate. I think what's trickier, but also, sort of what you can get out of a strongly run research procurement is that it is an opportunity to say, I want to answer these questions with, some details about, some of the thinking you might have on methods, but you don't have to spell out exactly how you want everything to work, because part of the point of procuring an expert is that they are bringing that expertise to the table and supporting you in figuring out how to do the research that you want to do well. And that was the challenge for me in figuring out how do you create a procurement where you're expected to really spell out very, very clearly, and expected to spell out clearly enough for those responding to be able to respond to what you're looking for, but also leaving that space to have that conversation and, sort of gain the benefit of the expertise of the vendors coming in to bid for the research.
I had to, yeah, similarly, like it's not paving 10 miles of interstate, so there's that. I would also say so we are engaged in a couple of qualitative research projects. And so I think for us also, there's an education piece, because I think when we talk about research, we can get pretty quantitative. I think there's a default to quantitative being what we do. And so trying to describe to people a qualitative process and what that would look like and what we're trying to get from it. And so I had a lot of questions about so it's storytelling. And I'm like, yes, but it's it's primary source research. And they're like, oh, but it's comms. And I'm like, it's not comms, it's research. So I think there's also just what has been enculturated as research can make describing what you're trying to do to help get to the best scope possible a little bit tricky, just because, I was talking about peaches and they were thinking oranges, and I was like, oh God, no, they're similar color and that's it, So that's another way that I think it can be different, is just by the design that you're looking for and what people's expectations of research can be.
Well, thank you. I think we should turn back to Teresa, who can maybe say a little bit more. I was very interested. You have to spell out what you need, but leave space. So how do you do that? So Teresa, let's go to your the second half of your presentation, which I think covers that a bit.
You're right, Julie, it does. I think we'll build nicely on what Jocelyn and Ariel just had to say there. Nick, can you put the slides back up for us, please? Great. So now we are going to focus on how to write up and advertise what you need. So that is about that spelling it out with enough space, and then review proposals and select who will do the work. Next slide. So actually the part of the procurement process that is about writing up what you need and striking that balance between putting it all in there and leaving the space is this developing a request for proposal, or you might have heard Jocelyn and Ariel use some other terms. So request for proposal is abbreviated as RFP. They also mentioned RFR and RFA. Your state might have some other abbreviation. They mean sort of all the same thing, and we're going to focus on the essence here of what it is. And then as you explore in your own state, they will provide you with some additional guidance. So essentially, a request for proposal is both about the format and the content for writing up what you need and providing instructions to the people that you want to have respond. So if we think about this, really there are these 5 pieces here, and I'm going to talk briefly about each of those pieces. So you have the purpose and goals. You want to describe what you want to have done and why. And then you have a part that's called the statement of work. And that is really the largest part that focuses on the content and how you want people to approach the work. When Jocelyn was talking and Ariel, they both used the terminology scope. And this is where you kind of map out that scope. In your statement of work, it includes the research questions, what you want answered, and specific requests you have about the approach. So for example, do you want to hear from particular groups of people that you serve, or hear about particular needs? So perhaps you want to hear more from the families that you're serving through your child care subsidy program or through consumer education referral services. You want to know how they're experiencing their interactions with your agency or the folks that you've contracted to do that work. Or you want to hear from the childcare workforce about how they're experiencing the professional development services that you've offered, or getting their salary supplements or wage payments or whatever it might be. You would put into this part, the statement of work, some specific guidance about that. And as Jocelyn said, it's a little bit of an art, because you want to provide enough information so that when people respond and submit their proposal for how they want to do the work for you, that they address all the things that you're interested in, but leave enough out so that they can demonstrate to you that they have the expertise, that they can bring complement what you're asking for with what they would bring to the table. Another part of the statement of work are the deliverables. And these are the actual items or products that you want as a result of the work. Is it a report? Is it a data set? Is it a series of memos? Do you want some kind of graphic that you can share? So this is where you spell that out so that folks know what it is they should produce as a result of doing the research. You should include any kinds of required activities and permissions about sharing the work. Maybe you want to share it widely. And so part of what the team would produce is something that's going to be a public report, But then you also want to include, well, who can share that and when, what kind of permission is required. Maybe you want the work to be all internal. It's something that's going to inform your decision making, but not be publicized widely. Put that information into your statement of work. Any expected timelines of the work? So does this need to be from the time that they get the award to do the work until the time they produce the report and it's ready to go out the door? Is that a 6-month time period? Is that a 1-year time period? Is that going to go over 4 years? You know, what does that kind of timeline look like for you? And in thinking about that, you know, basically you're thinking about when do you need that information? Are you trying to feed it into a particular timeline or decision-making process? And what kind of expected communications should happen during the project? How often will you want to meet with the researchers? Or how often do you want them to update you on progress? And how do you want them to do that? Another part of the request for proposal are understanding the expertise and qualifications of the people that are proposing to do the service. What do you want your bidders to share about the expertise of those people who will do the work? You know, what kind of former experience do they have? How do they demonstrate that if you want them to talk to families, that's something that they're used to doing? If you want them to do some kind of sophisticated quantitative analysis, that's something that they're an expert in. Next, you want to be sure to give some budget guidance. The level of effort for the work is really important. You heard Jocelyn talking about this and about the challenge sometimes in figuring this out. But you have to provide some kind of guidance in your request for proposal, because otherwise you will get proposals to do either more work or work that takes more time or is considerably more expensive than you were expecting or you have the budget to do, or something that is less work and less time than you were expecting. And so providing some way of giving a budget target, it doesn't have to actually be like the maximum amount that you would be willing to purchase the services for, but this is one of the ways that research can be different, because it is a little bit harder to price out. So providing some of that guidance in your document is fairly important. And then the timeline of when they need to respond to the proposal with their proposal. So you know, say you're putting out an announcement in June, at the beginning of June, and maybe you're asking for folks to submit their proposal six weeks later. Next slide. So one key to aligning your request proposal with your research needs is identifying your data needs. You heard both Jocelyn and Ariel talk about this a little bit. Some questions you can ask yourself to help you figure out what kind of timeline you're going to need to build in for getting the research work done is, do we have the data already, or do we need to collect new data? So for example, if you want someone to examine your subsidy application data or your licensing data, that's data that you have already that you collected as part of the services that you provide. But if you want to get people's perspectives or experiences, either families or childcare providers, then that's new data that has to be collected. And the timelines for those are a little bit different, and the way you would map that out is a little bit different. How do we protect the data and the people? So in terms of sharing data that you already have, that might be another area where you need to check with your state about the requirements around that. Many states have particular data sharing or data use agreements. For example, if you're going to share the data that you have, how do you make sure that the group that you're sharing it with can protect it to the standard that you expect? What are those kinds of standards? Sometimes states have their own, what they call an institutional review board, which is designed to protect the people that the data represents, whether it's the data that you've already collected or the data that will be collected by the research team. And then who will own the data? When you're finished with the data collection, or once a team has looked at your data and kind of done something to prepare it for analysis and perhaps created some new variables based on that data, is it now still your data, or can that research team have ownership of it in some way? Anyway, mapping out those expectations about that are important. And finally, have we built in enough time for all the data related steps? So whether it's creating the agreements to share the existing data, or the time to collect new data, there's going to need to be time to clean up the data for analysis purposes, and then do analyses, interpret what that means. All of those various things. It takes some time to do that, and that helps you think about those parts of the scope of the work, how you might want to map that out. Next slide. So in addition to the content of the RFP, there's also the RFP process itself. Each government agency is likely to have very specific legal requirements about this part. You'll want to check in to make sure you understand what the requirements are about offering opportunities and instructions on questions and answers about this RFP. The format and delivery method. So for example, are folks sending it to you as paper copies, or through email, or submitting it through a system? What kind of legal requirements and payment methods are there? And what kind of review criteria and process is needed? Next slide. And so at the start of your procurement planning, you need to be planning for the end. We have some tips on getting ready for the review and selection process. You want to be sure this process meets state criteria, provides a transparent process. So talking about how it is that you're going to make the selection. Are certain factors going to be considered for a certain number of points? That it avoids bias and accounts for specialized knowledge needed. So this might have to do with who is on your review team, and accounts for staffing time and timing needed. So staffing time, in other words, how much time is this going to take your staff? It's a project in and of itself to manage the procurement. The timelines it has to meet to get through all the steps. Sorry, lost my train of thought there. Anyway, there are multiple steps in this process, and getting ready for the end at the beginning is something that you need to be thinking about doing. So our panelists now are going to share their perspectives and experiences with you, and I'm sending us back to Julia. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Teresa. Next slide. It's really helpful that you laid that out so clearly. And of course, people, well, we'll have the recording available, but also can look at the document to hear it again, or to see it in written form. So now it's time for questions and reflections. We'll start off again with the insights from our guests from Massachusetts and North Carolina, and then we'll have a final period of questions, reflections, and comments from you, which you can drop in the chat now. And we do love to hear from you all, especially CCDF lead agency staff. We can take down the slide and zoom in on me and our two guests. So my first question, Teresa was talking about those different key elements to the RFP, and she mentioned, let me turn my video on, I'm sorry. She mentioned that one of the key elements is the expertise and qualifications of the bidder. Ariel, could you speak more to the importance of that element?
Yeah, I think that one's, pretty self-explanatory. I mean, you want people who can do the job and do it well. I think a thing that I would maybe a cautionary, I don't know that it's cautionary, but just something to have in mind is that it is easy for us to get into the habit of using certain vendors because we know that they are going to produce solid content, a quality product, that they are easy to work with, whatever the compilation of skills is. I think something that has become that we are working on being a standard for us is that we cultivate a wide and diverse set of vendors so that there is not that there's not the expectation that like vendor X is going to get this contract. This is vendor X's contract. And that's just not like a healthy way to think about how to procure things. So I would say like looking for people who have the right sets of skills and abilities and time, right? I mean, they have to have the capacity to be able to do it or to scale up, but also like think about the diversity of your vendors. And so if you haven't used a company or a vendor, but they have, maybe they have a special focus on dual language learners or something that's just a thing that you need in your state that you don't really have, and it's going to add something to the conversation, I would say that's important. And it's something that we have not always done. Like we've definitely had a history of kind of using the same contractors over and over, and there's times that that's appropriate. But I think with research, it's great, and it's a really good place to bring diversity into your vending pool.
Thank you. So if you want good diversity, you also just, I think we were talking when we were planning this, that you have to make sure you get like more than one person bidding if you're going to have a choice. And so, Jocelyn, I was wondering if you could provide some advice or tips for making sure you get enough responses, and then, of course, that you get good responses.
So I would start by echoing what Ariel said, that so much of this is about building relationships and sort of building relationships with a broad and diverse set of vendors. We actually have built into our current procurement processes a pre-approved list for vendors, which on the one hand, it's sort of an extra step to get to a bid, but it also does provide a mechanism by which I can use to sort of encourage vendors to show their interest in working with Massachusetts, and then a list of people to outreach to every time we do put out a bid. But regardless of the mechanism, I just feel like it is so much of this is going to be driven by who knows us and is interested in working with us, because, for somebody to respond to an RFR we posted there, that's time and commitment on the vendor's part. So, there has to be an interest and a match in doing the work. And there's such a range of projects that we might be posting. So you do want a range of vendors for, the sake of capacity and the sake of being able to find a good match. I also do a fair amount. I put a little time into understanding. There are a lot of rules around what outreach you can do when you have a procurement out, but there are spaces where you can do some. And so, just sort of understanding when and how I can reach out to people and make sure everybody's aware that something's posted, that, encouraging people to consider it, take a look at it, think about it. I can't just do that with one vendor. I have to do it fairly with everybody who might be eligible. But I would say, particularly in some of the larger firms, it's helpful to draw the attention to a particular project, particularly if it's smaller. Draw the attention of somebody who might be interested in working on it.
And if I could just piggyback real quick, one of the things that we've had some good success with lately is doing a pre-bid conference. And so while we think we have written the best scope that has ever been written in the history of scopes, an outside person will read it and be like, what are they even looking for? Or what we've had the other experience of people write for it and we're like, ew, that's not what we thought we were asking. So we've just learned that having a pre-bid conference to really get very clear about like what we mean when we say X, Y, or Z, and to be able to answer some questions. I mean, to your point, there's a limit to how much we can say, but that's been super helpful for us. So I think that's been one of the best things that we've added as a kind of standard protocol. And then I would just say also, don't be afraid to put it back out. If you didn't get what you need, don't pay for something you don't need. Don't do that. And we get pressured to do it. Like, I get that, but timelines matter. But man, we want a good product.
That's an excellent point. We've used the pre-bid conference as well. And it's just such a great way to get questions and, sort of help everybody understand it better. I will also say too, the RFR tends to be pretty dry, and it is an opportunity to talk up the project a little bit as well, and sort of talk about what's exciting and interesting about it.
Great. Well, I have more questions, but I want to make sure folks in the audience have time for questions. So I guess, do we have another slide? No, need another slide. I want to thank you, Teresa, for your presentation. And Nick, can you add Teresa to the spotlight so that people can ask questions of any of us? Because this is the time for you to, again, give questions or comments. Just drop them in the chat or, raise your hand. And I see Peter has said welcoming them. Let's see if there's any more questions. I'll give you a moment to think. And then, of course, I always have questions. Well, while we're waiting for questions, I will say, I like how Teresa said how often it is not like internal versus external research, it's having them work together. So Jocelyn, I know that, could you say more about how internal researchers and external researchers work together in your agency?
Sure. So I think, it's changed over time, just sort of depending on the capacity that we have internally. I think when it was just me, and a really largely my role was navigating contracted researchers with the content experts, the project managers. Much of my work was really facilitating conversations, facilitating the relationship development, facilitating communication too, sort of helping. It was never really a problem. We've had vendors that have been really great at, sort of understanding the practical importance of what we're doing and talking to the project team. But, sometimes helping people understand, why there's certain questions coming up about differences between, different methodological choices, supporting the thought process and finding the time and space to think about the implications of the research and particularly the findings. We've also then sort of a complementary piece of the work, and what has been more what we focused on building out internally is developing our own both data analytic capacity, but also the extent to which we have a team that's focusing on our data systems and thinking about the extent to which, as we do ongoing system development, those systems are designed not just to meet operational needs, but also to get us some of the data that we want to understand the effectiveness of some of the work that we're doing. So then there's an added opportunity now to have internal relationships between the data team and the researchers, so that it's both thinking about, what does the project teams need, but also what data do we have that we can support, and where can our team be helpful. in building and designing the projects? And then also, is there small scale work that we can do internally now that we have this capacity? Does everything have to be bid out, or is some of the work, particularly when it's monitoring type work, can we just, pull the data ourselves and do it in-house?
Thanks, Jocelyn. I remember that earlier, Christina Clayton, I guess I've seen from the District of Columbia, I did have a question about, what is the internal research capacity? So I hope we're answering your question, Christina, and that this is helpful, but feel free to ask another if you have another. I do see Brian Cullen is asking, do any of the presenter states have more strict procurement processes? And if so, do procurement policies pose challenges to you?
I will say something Jocelyn kind of mentioned earlier is that I think there are, I don't want to say fake or made up, but assumed policies that are not real policies more often than that there are kind of more rigorous real policies. The place that's different for us that is not around research is for IT. So IT procurement is incredibly challenging in my state. There's a lot that goes into that, but I think for me, most of what I've experienced is that people have assumptions about what a policy is, and when you actually go to code and rule, it is not there. It doesn't exist in that way.
It's sometimes helpful to think of, sort of figuring out how to do what you want in the context of the rules is sort of a fun challenge. And finding somebody who understands the rules, who wants to engage with that type of thinking is incredibly helpful as well.
Yeah, when we were talking about those gatekeepers, they can also be very helpful to, like, when you can get really specific. And I think it's like, I found this, so I've worked in a lot of Head Starts, and there's kind of like a myth about from people like, oh, well, Head Start won't let you do that. And I'm like, that is not true. Like, show me in the performance standards where you can't do that, and it's not there, right? So, so I think, yeah. But those gatekeepers can also be helpful to say, oh yeah, here's how we did it this one time, and we figured out how to kind of navigate a little path around that rule.
To be fair, they're trying to keep us out of jail.
I don't like orange. It's not a good color. Like, I don't want to go to Grant's jail, but I also want to get done the good work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
Can I share? I know that we don't have a ton of time left, but one of my dreams, Julia, can I share a dream that I have?
Yes,
really
this
hard
is my time to ask for closing remarks. And Ariel, okay, you can make a closing remark about a dream.
I have a dream that I think we all like to think that we have incredibly special states that are very different from one another, and that our context is super different. And in some ways that's true, but in most of the ways it's not true. And so I have this dream that states would be able to kind of come together and be able to pool resources to do better research, or more kind of like interesting research across. So like, if we were able to think about, I bordered Tennessee, Georgia, Virginia, so places that have like metro areas and lots of very rural areas. So like, if we could figure out how to do something better together. And I know that there's been a little bit of work that y'all have been able to do that in New England, but we have not cracked that nut. So that's my dream, is that we could do more shared work and just be able to learn more and share the kind of burden and glory of it together.
Thank you, Ariel. It's nice to hear that dream. Jocelyn, any quick tip for people who are working on procuring research and evaluation services?
I mean, I think we've covered most of, it's finding the right people to help you. It's sort of figuring out how to work around, sort of work with and around the processes that are the legal requirements that you're working with. And I think also just remembering that this is all in service of the research, which is really the exciting part. And a lot of the procurement time is spent on that fun part, which is figuring out what you want, figuring out how to talk about what you want, figuring out, who you might want to work with, and, how to solicit responses from people, not solicit exactly, but, make sure you get that strong pool of vendors coming in that is bringing the skills that you want. And, that's the fun part too, because what I love about doing this work is every time we have a new project, I get to work with a new group of people, and I learn something new, and both about the procurement process and about the research. So, there's so much opportunity every time you put one of these out. It's I think keeping an eye on that and remembering that it's really, most of it is the fun part.
Great. And Teresa, your closing remarks.
Sure. Can you bring the slides back up, please? So I'm just going to point you to some resources. As Julia noted, that's one of the things that we do in the Research and Evaluation Capacity Center. So the first one is the Procuring Research and Evaluation Services, a guide for CCDF lead agencies and researchers, written by myself, Teresa Derrick Mills, Travis Reginald, and Julia Isaacs in 2020. And that's the one we've been focused on. But you can also check out the OPRE website for slides, audio recordings, and transcripts of webinars, typically posted a few months after each webinar. We have all of the resources that we've created through our Capacity Building Center. So check out the Building Childcare Research Capacity webpage for slides from past webinars, as well as other resources, briefs, and reports and guides. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, Teresa Derrick Mills, at tderrick-mills@urban.org. Please help us evaluate this webinar by responding to 2 poll questions that are going to come up in just a minute. And if you could just stay for a moment after the poll, Julia will have an announcement about the next webinar. Thanks. Next slide.
So Nick will launch our poll. Two questions. What selects your best represents your perspective on the following statement? As a whole, the webinar was a good use of my time. Strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. And then please select the option that best represents your perspective on the following statement. My knowledge or skills have increased as a result of the session. Same responses. I'll wait 10 seconds and then I'm going to ask for the last slide, please. Okay, the last slide, Nick. So we're in the midst of planning our future webinars, and we're working on right now is one on equity and inclusion, taking that lens and bringing it to data and research, and we're planning that for late November, so stay tuned. And I want to just thank you, Teresa, thank you, Ariel, thank you, Jocelyn, and thank you, everyone, for participating. This has been, hopefully it's been useful to you. And I think we will say goodbye and perhaps see you at a future webinar. Thanks, everyone.